They said living in a neighborhood run by an HOA would mean peace, order, and safety. But what I got instead was a nightmare dressed up in rules and fines. Imagine waking up one morning to find your own property slipping out of your hands. Not because you missed payments, not because you broke the law, but because someone decided your land was their playground. I watched the line between arrogance and theft disappear before my eyes. What would you do if the very people meant to protect your community tried to take everything from you? When my family and I first moved into the neighborhood, it felt like the fresh start we had always dreamed of. The streets were lined with well kept lawns, neighbors waved politely as they passed by in golf carts, and everything seemed so perfect it could have come straight out of a brochure. For us, it wasn't about luxury, it was about stability. A quiet home, a safe place to raise kids, and the comfort of knowing we had finally found somewhere to put down roots. At first, the HOA only felt like background noise. They sent friendly welcome letters, newsletters about community events, and little reminders about keeping things in harmony. It all seemed harmless enough, almost like a guarantee that this neighborhood would never fall apart. But as time went on, I began to notice how quickly that friendly mask slipped when someone didn't fit into their picture of perfection. Neighbors whispered about fines for flower beds that weren't the right color. Homeowners frustrated over mailboxes painted two shades too dark. Even parents scolded for letting their kids' bikes sit in the driveway. These stories felt distant then, petty inconveniences that couldn't possibly touch us. Still, a part of me wondered how long it would be before the HOA's sharp eyes landed on our family. Looking back now, the warning signs were there from the start. What seemed like harmless rules and suggestions would soon reveal themselves as tools of control. And in a community where appearances mattered more than people, it was only a matter of time before our quiet life turned into a battle we never asked for. The first real clash came as small as a letter. It was slipped neatly into my mailbox, dressed up in polite language but sharp enough to cut. The HOA claimed that my front lawn did not meet community standards. According to them, the grass was half an inch too long. The flower beds were not properly aligned with the property's visual harmony. And, most absurdly, the shade of paint on my shutters was slightly off compared to the approved palette. At first, I laughed. Surely this was nothing more than a misunderstanding. After all, how could half an inch of grass or a barely noticeable paint shade matter to anyone? But the laughter didn't last long. A week later, another letter arrived, this one more severe, stamped with warnings and threats of fines. They demanded payment if I didn't comply. When I called the HOA office to clarify, the tone was cold, almost rehearsed. They said the rules were non negotiable and that my failure to follow them would impact the integrity of the community. I hung up feeling less like a homeowner and more like a criminal. No words changed. That's when the fines began piling up. $50 for leaving my trash can by the curb an hour too long. $100 for a small crack in the driveway they claimed was an eyesore. $200 because my kids left a basketball hoop near the garage. Each infraction felt petty on its own, but together they painted a clear picture. This wasn't about rules. It was about control. I tried to reason with them. I attended the monthly HOA meeting, walking into a room that looked more like a courtroom than a community gathering. The president, a woman with an icy smile and a clipboard clutched tightly in her hands, sat at the center like a judge waiting to deliver a sentence. I explained my situation calmly, pointing out that none of these so-called violations truly harmed anyone. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she leaned forward, tapped her pen against the table, and said, "Rules exist for a reason. If you can't follow them, maybe this isn't the right community for you." Those words lit a fire in me. This wasn't about grass or paint anymore. This was about power. The HOA wasn't protecting the neighborhood. They were tightening their grip on anyone who dared to step even slightly out of line. Things only got worse. One morning, I woke up to find a bright orange notice taped to my front door. It was a violation warning, accusing me of altering property lines. Confused, I stepped outside and realized what they meant. The HOA had hired surveyors, without my permission, to mark off sections of my yard. They claimed part of my property technically belonged to the common area and was therefore under their control. The audacity was staggering. My land, my yard, suddenly up for debate because the HOA decided so. I began documenting everything, every letter, every fine, every conversation. I took photos of my yard, the so-called violations, even the notices taped to my door. Deep down, I knew this was building towards something much bigger, something uglier. And I wasn't wrong. The harassment extended beyond paper. I noticed unfamiliar cars parked near my house at odd hours, their drivers watching me as if waiting for me to slip up. Neighbors I once waved to began avoiding me, clearly pressured or threatened by the HOA to keep their distance. It felt isolating, like the walls of my own home were closing in. Then came the most shocking escalation yet. Construction equipment rolled into the neighborhood one morning, tearing through the quiet air with the sound of drills and bulldozers. I thought maybe it was a road repair or a new community project. But when I followed the noise, my jaw dropped. They were building on my land. The HOA president herself stood on site, clipboard in hand, directing workers as if she owned the place. They claimed it was a community enhancement project, but in reality, they were pouring foundations for what would soon be revealed as a private villa. A villa she had no intention of sharing, no intention of justifying, because in her mind, she was untouchable. I tried to stop them, but the HOA waved around legal papers, documents stamped and signed with jargon meant to intimidate me. They claimed easements, technicalities, and obscure bylaws gave them the right. None of it made sense. None of it felt real. Yet day after day, I watched as the skeleton of a $6 million villa rose from the ground, on the property I paid for, on the land I worked for. Every time I passed by the construction, I felt the sting of humiliation. Neighbors whispered, some in shock, others too afraid to speak up. And the president? She acted as if she had already won, as if I was nothing more than a nuisance standing in the way of her empire. But deep down, I refused to accept defeat. The more they pushed, the more determined I became. I kept gathering evidence, kept filing complaints, kept searching through HOA bylaws late into the night. I knew I was being outspent, outmaneuvered, and outnumbered. But I also knew something the president didn't. Arrogance blinds people. And in her arrogance, she had made a mistake. The letters, the fines, the land grab, all of it was leading to something explosive. I just had to hold on long enough to see it through. The day of reckoning didn't arrive with quiet letters or whispered threats. It came with the sound of hammers and laughter echoing from the half-built villa, rising like a monument to arrogance on my land. By then, the structure had become impossible to ignore. A gaudy palace in the middle of a suburban neighborhood, towering over every modest home like a reminder of who supposedly held power here. The president strutted across the site daily, barking orders at workers, her clipboard always in hand, her eyes occasionally flicking toward my house as if daring me to do something about it. And I did. For months, I had been collecting every scrap of evidence, every unjust fine, every notice, every clause from the HOA bylaws they had twisted beyond recognition. I had pored over land records late into the night, cross-referencing deeds, property lines, and easements. I had spoken with lawyers, surveyors, even former HOA board members who had quietly slipped away after realizing what kind of corruption had taken root. Piece by piece, I built a case. Not just against the petty fines or harassment, but against the entire charade the president was running. When the day of the HOA's quarterly meeting arrived, I walked into that room not as a victim, but as a storm ready to break. The usual setup was there. Board members lined at the front, the president seated like royalty, neighbors scattered in the crowd. Some looked at me with pity, others with curiosity, but all of them knew something was about to happen. The president opened the meeting with her usual smug routine, rattling off new rules and proudly announcing community improvements, including the villa she framed as a shared amenity project. My blood boiled at the audacity. She wasn't just stealing from me, she was rewriting reality in front of everyone. When she finally asked if anyone had questions, I stood. My voice was calm, steady, but sharp enough to cut through the room. I laid out the facts. The land survey proving the villa sat squarely on my property. The bylaws showing the HOA had no authority to seize or alter private land. The chain of fines, letters, and harassment that painted a clear picture of abuse of power. I held up copies of stamped legal documents, proof that I had filed a lawsuit not just for damages, but for full restitution and removal of the HOA president from her position. The room shifted, whispers spread. The board members glanced nervously at one another, realizing they were implicated by association. The president's face paled, her composure cracking for the first time. She tried to interrupt, dismissing my evidence as misinterpretations, but I pressed harder, louder, revealing the final blow: court filings that froze all construction until the case was resolved. Her villa, her monument of arrogance, was officially illegal. Gasps echoed through the room. The neighbors who had avoided me for months suddenly leaned forward, hungry for every word. For the first time, the president had no control, no smug smile, no dismissive retort. She sat frozen, cornered by her own arrogance, her empire crumbling in front of the very people she ruled with fear. And then, like dominoes, the board collapsed. One member announced their resignation on the spot, unwilling to be tied to the scandal. Another demanded an internal vote of no confidence. The crowd erupted, voices rising, neighbors calling out every petty injustice they had suffered under her reign. Years of bottled up frustration poured out, and in that moment, she was no longer a leader. She was the villain, unmasked in front of everyone. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to gloat. The evidence, the law, and the community itself had done what I alone could never achieve. The villa stood unfinished, a hollow shell destined to become nothing more than a monument to her downfall. As the meeting spiraled into chaos, I stepped back, my heart pounding with a mix of relief and rage, vindication and exhaustion. This wasn't the end. Not yet. The court battle loomed ahead, promises of restitution and justice still waiting to be claimed. But for the first time in months, I wasn't the one on the defensive. The tide had turned, and the president knew it. I caught her eyes one last time across the room. Her clipboard hung uselessly at her side, her lips trembling as if searching for words that wouldn't come. And in that silence, I knew she finally understood. She had built her empire on stolen ground, and now it was collapsing beneath her feet. This was no longer about fines, rules, or appearances. This was about justice, and justice at long last was mine to deliver. The weeks that followed the explosive HOA meeting were a blur of legal filings, hushed conversations, and a neighborhood buzzing with whispers. For months, I had lived under a cloud of fines, threats, and harassment, convinced I was isolated in the fight. But the moment the president's empire cracked, something shifted. People who had once looked away began stopping by my house, quietly sharing their own stories. A retired couple admitted they had been fined for hanging a wind chime too close to the property line. A single mother confessed she was billed for painting her garage door without advance approval, even though the color matched the so-called standards perfectly. Piece by piece, I realized I had not been the exception. I had been the warning. And when I finally stood up, the illusion of her power broke for everyone. But while the community rallied, the courtroom became the true battlefield. The lawsuit I had filed gained traction quickly, largely because the evidence was overwhelming. I had photos of survey markers, legal land descriptions, and records showing my deed stretched directly beneath the villa's foundations. More damning were the HOA's own documents, which contradicted their claims. Buried deep in meeting notes and email chains were references to fast-tracking the president's project, skirting official approval processes, and intimidating dissenters into silence. It wasn't just mismanagement. It was corruption, plain and simple. The president, once so confident, arrived in court diminished. Gone were her sharp suits and smug grin. Instead, she carried herself like a cornered animal. Her lawyers argued technicalities, waiving obscure clauses, but every time they tried, my attorneys countered with solid evidence. The judge's patience wore thin as it became clear the HOA had not only overstepped but trampled basic property rights. And then came the moment I will never forget: the court's ruling. The judge declared the villa an unlawful construction, ordered an immediate halt to all development, and transferred ownership of the structure, every wall, every beam, every polished stone, to me as the rightful landowner. The courtroom erupted. Gasps filled the air, neighbors in attendance covering their mouths, while the president's face drained of color. Her $6 million monument, built on arrogance and stolen ground, was legally mine. But the victory didn't stop there. The court demanded the HOA reimburse me for damages, legal costs, and years of harassment. And in perhaps the most humiliating blow, the president was barred from serving on the board ever again. Her reign was over. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt lighter than I had in years. The villa loomed unfinished on my property, but now it wasn't a symbol of loss. It was proof of what happens when you refuse to be silenced. The aftermath rippled across the neighborhood. The HOA board, desperate to salvage their reputation, scrambled to reform. They voted in new members, homeowners who had once stayed silent but now demanded fairness and transparency. Fines dropped dramatically. Rules were rewritten to reflect reason, not obsession. For the first time since moving there, the community felt like it belonged to the people again, not the whims of a power-hungry tyrant. As for the former president, her downfall was swift and merciless. Word spread of the court's decision, tarnishing her reputation not only in the neighborhood, but across nearby communities where she had boasted of her leadership. She sold her own home quietly, slipping away like a shadow. The last I heard, she was embroiled in bankruptcy proceedings, the weight of legal fees and lost credibility dragging her down. In the end, she had destroyed herself with the very greed she thought would make her untouchable. And what about me? I had a choice to make: keep the villa, finish construction, and turn it into the dream home it was never meant to be, or tear it down as a final act of defiance. After long nights of thought, I chose something in between. I completed the villa, not as a monument to her arrogance, but as a symbol of resilience. It became a home for my family, a place where every room carried a reminder that justice, though slow, is not impossible. The neighbors began calling it the house that beat the HOA. And in a way, that's exactly what it was. Looking back now, the entire ordeal feels almost surreal. The endless fines, the whispered threats, the isolation, all of it seemed designed to break me. But instead, it sharpened me. It taught me the value of persistence, of refusing to accept injustice even when it feels overwhelming. There's something profoundly absurd about the fact that a strip of grass, a paint shade, or a misplaced basketball hoop can become weapons of control. Yet beneath that absurdity lies something serious. Power unchecked will always seek to expand, to dominate, to consume. The HOA wasn't just about lawns and fences. It was about control, and control only works if people surrender to it. I didn't. And that made all the difference. So, what's the takeaway? It's not just about HOAs or neighborhood disputes or even property rights. It's about standing your ground when someone tries to take what's yours. It's about refusing to let fear, fines, or intimidation silence you. And it's about remembering that sometimes the most powerful act of revenge is simply surviving long enough to see your enemies bury themselves. The villa still stands today, sunlit and strong, a constant reminder of the battle that nearly broke me. Neighbors who once avoided me now stop to chat, sharing laughter where once there was suspicion. The community feels alive again. Imperfect, yes, but no longer strangled by fear. Every time I walk through the front doors, I remember the woman who thought she could steal my land and crown herself queen of the neighborhood. And every time, I smile at the thought that she built me a mansion with her arrogance. Justice doesn't always come fast. It doesn't always come easy. But when it does, it leaves behind something stronger than walls or titles. It leaves behind truth. And maybe that's the